Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Our next program today will be titled From Deprogramming to the Intervention 101 Approach, the Evolution of Cult Interventions, presented by Rachel Bernstein, Patrick Ryan, and Joseph Kelly. Rachel Bernstein, LMFT, MSED, has been working with former cult members for nearly 30 years. She is a licensed marriage and family therapist and educator who lives in Los Angeles, California. She has presented at ICSA many times, contributed many talks, and also runs the Indoctrination podcast. Patrick Ryan is a graduate of Maharishi International University. He has been a cult intervention specialist, exit counseling, mediation, religious conflict resolution, thought reform consulting since 1984. Joseph Kelly is a graduate of Temple University and has been a thought reform consultant since 1988. For years, he has co-facilitated the ICSA pre-conference workshop for ex-members, and he has helped with ICSA's monthly meetings in Philadelphia. Websites are intervention101.com, Cult Mediation, and Cult Recovery 101. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and turn the time over to you three. Thank you so much for being here today.
Everybody, it is wonderful to be able to participate with you during this conference, even virtually. And I hope one day, very soon, we'll be able to be in person and be able to see each other and be able to commiserate and catch up. And for some of you to meet each other face to face. I am so happy to be able to do this, but I also know that there is an irony to being distant. And I am so grateful to ICSA for providing this opportunity for people, for former members, for loved ones, for people who just want to learn about the subject, to be able to connect and to learn. But I also know that what a lot of you are experiencing is a feeling of isolation in the world outside, the world that is not filled with people who get it and who understand what you're talking about. And so I know ICSA is doing its utmost to pierce that isolation in the best way that it can. So I hope, even though this is virtual, you get a feeling that I'm there with you and speaking directly to you. I am so happy to be able to talk with Pat and with Joe, two people who I respect very much, who I've learned a lot from, and whose work I respect because of the way they approach it. I have been working with former cult members and their families for over 30 years now, which is unbelievable to me, I must say. And I have also run former cult member support groups and still run one every other Wednesday night virtually. And also have run groups for families and friends of those in cults. And every once in a while, families and friends do join this support group so that they can kind of share stories, share ideas, and learn from each other and support each other. I also have expanded my practice so that I work also with people who have been in relationships with narcissists, as that really mimics the cult relationship in kind of all too perfect ways, unfortunately. And also now I'm inundated with clients where people are dealing with losing, as they say, losing family members and friends to conspiratorial thinking. And so it's been a very busy time. And when I talk with the other people in the field, they also say it's a very busy, busy time. So I think what I appreciate most about doing interventions in the way that they're done and sanctioned by the law and by ICSA and by Pat and Joe, who I sometimes do them with, is that there is a family model that's connected to it, whether the family be a partner or a group of friends, if that's the family, and the family might still be in the group or might be disconnected. I think what's important about expanding it to really looking at a whole team approach, a whole family or group approach, is that you're not just focused on the one person who people are concerned about, because that person is connected to other people. That person is part of a family system usually. They are the ones who are worried about them. They're the ones who want to learn about what's happening and why this happened to their loved one, or how to rescue their loved one. They're the ones who really should be a part of the discussion and part of the effort to be able to help their loved one break free. But often they want to know how, and they want to understand. They want to be able to know what happened. They want to be able to help heal also any interactions they've had in the past with this person that were more confrontational, that may have not been filled with the kind of wording and approach that is most helpful. Tricky part is those kinds of interactions, the what are you doing, or why are you following this person, or how come you can't see what we see, are the ones that are the most natural. And so part of our guidance is to help people kind of take a step back and do something that's pretty counterintuitive and approach things in a different way. And that's why I think it's important to get this kind of counsel and to get this kind of advice, so that you feel like you are coming into those interactions more informed. And I think it's really good to take care of the whole system, of the whole family, if you can. I see a system, again, whether it's a marital system, a friendship system, family system, as a mobile. And if you pull on one part of a mobile, the other parts kind of shake until they find a way to kind of settle down again. So each part is connected to another part. Each part impacts another part. And a lot of people, a lot of the loved ones haven't gotten support, or they haven't been able to have really a sense of being believed about being concerned about their loved one. Or parents all too often, as I've talked about, are told that they are kind of being overly cautious or overly controlling or paranoid about their child or their loved one, and they're just having trouble letting them individuate and have freedom, which of course, as we know in this field, is an irony, because usually the family's trying to get them back to being able to have freedom. So Pat and Joe do the kind of work that helps to sort of solve a puzzle. And we together try to solve these puzzles. There's so many pieces, there's so much history. We want to also be able to heal the situation that might exist in the family system. Either it pre-existed, it happened where there was family discord or dissension, difficult times, a difficult history, or there's just a lot of hurt feelings because of their loved one having been involved. There's blaming of the other parent. It's your fault, or this is because of your DNA or your side of the family, or you should have taught them this or that, or that one parent is upset with the other parent for not being as involved in this effort. There are a lot of feelings. So it's really important to work on that, not only for the family, but for the hopefully soon former member who is going to be coming back into that system, or at least having interactions with them. And you want them to be grateful and happy to be there, and not say, oh, right, I need to be elsewhere, or this is why I left. And so we also look at a person's history, their mental history, their health history, their familial history, and also how much pressure is applied by the group to keep them in it, how much fear they're going to be given for leaving it, what they're going to be carrying around with them, even if they're thinking that it's time to go. But are they going to be so racked with fear or post-traumatic stress syndrome, or racked with so much post-traumatic stress that it's very hard for them to even listen to you while you're trying to help them or talk to them? We want to know. And so it is important to, I think, to expand on some of the ideas that I just talked about. Each family, each couple has its own culture, and it has its own language, and they behave in a certain way and relate to each other in a certain way. And that's why it's good for us to know the families. Now, again, I know and we know that there's some people who have left and their families are still in the group. So again, we're talking about whoever they're coming back out to. And it could be cousins, and it could be, again, a group of friends or even neighbors, as I've seen in some cases. And I think it's also important to have people involved who are open to our suggestions, but also that we're going to be open to theirs, because sometimes really they're the experts on the history and their loved one. And we want to also be able to define who should be the one to make the contact, or at least try to make contact, or try to have that difficult conversation with the loved one. Should it be a parent? Should it be a sibling? Should it be a friend? Should it be a teacher? What are those relationships like? How much history do they have? And how much tension is associated with them? And also, who's been most demonized by the group? Because that's not the first person probably who should make contact, because that's going to cause the loved one to just shut down. And that might be the end of the opportunity in that moment to have any kind of contact. So when we meet with families, we certainly feel their pain and their sense of being out of their league and having never dealt with this situation before, because who has? And we want to also see how family is interacting with the other members of the family. This is not to judge them, but just to understand, to see if there's just natural tension, to see if there's scapegoating, to see if there's blaming, because you want to address that again so that you give the former member a safe place to land. And there are plenty of people who have come back and their families are so grateful and so happy and so relieved, but then they left to go back to a group, that group or a different one, just because it was so unpleasant in their home. So in situations where we're working with people who have come out of groups or who are coming out, and most of their loved ones are still in, it's going to be also important for us to connect them with other people, with other former members, with people who are other people in their lives, so that they don't feel alone. Isolation is horrible anyway, but if you feel like you've left something and you don't yet know where you belong in this world, and if you have connections to the people outside, it's really important for people to know that they do have connections. And that's also one of the reasons why these conferences are so important. When we also talk about families, we try to not overwhelm them, and we try to be a support system, because our job is not to panic them, to get them to kind of move faster if we think that really there's some danger or potential danger here, or neglect or abuse, of course, but also to help them take kind of a step back and take some time to learn, take some time to connect, take some time to heal, take some time to rest even, so that they have the energy to embark on a potential intervention. It's also good to get as much history as you can on the person who's involved in the cultic group, to see if there are things in their past that they can feel proud of and good about, so that they don't feel like they won't again have any success in the world outside or a place for them. Because so many of these controllers and these cultic groups will rewrite people's history, usually in the negative, that the people outside are the ones you can't trust, that your life wasn't good leading up to this moment that you were lucky enough to get involved in this group. And that's usually just not the case. There are things in people's history that they can feel good about. There are people in people's lives outside that they can still feel good about, and relationships. So when we work with people, we know that some people are going to be tremendously scared of leaving, or are worried also that leaving means that they failed in some way, or that they failed God, or that they failed the mission, or that they're going to get punished in some way for leaving, or their loved ones will get punished if they leave. And so we are also aware that sometimes when people come out, they have been so programmed to not feel deserving, of a good life and a happy life. So we know that people carry that with them outside of a cult. And so we will often let families know, when someone has come home, it's not the time to have a big party and have people over and have balloons and celebrate, even though you're feeling so relieved and celebratory, because the person coming out often is carrying so many burdens. They are either being harassed by the people in the group to get them to come back, or they really are not feeling capable anymore because that was taken away from them. They can't trust their own instincts, their own mind. Again, they don't know whom to trust. And so to know, again, that's why it's very important for them to not be in a situation then that is fraught with any kind of discord or disagreement or tension. It will all be too much. There are times that I also work with families and I really find that it's hard for them to believe that if they say something in a softer way, that it's going to make more of an impact. And I think they feel, and I understand this, that if maybe they just have one shot at this, they have to throw everything into it. And it's really hard to dial that down. It feels like an impossibility, but it's so important to do that. Another kind of counterintuitive piece of this. It's not necessarily your last opportunity to talk to them, but just in case there's the chance of that, you want to make sure it goes well. And if you overwhelm them, it won't. So while, of course, we have in mind the person who the loved ones are trying to rescue, when families get the support that they need, when they get counseling, when they get guidance, when they can connect with other families, when they actually are able to feel believed and understood, then they're able to be on this track of healing and empowerment and a feeling of kind of emotional safety and connection. And it's something that all families deserve, especially when they've been through something like this. I understand also that there are times there is one person within a family system who kind of takes the reins and they feel like that was sort of left to them to do, that they weren't given an option and that they're somehow put in charge. It's an unfair burden, but sometimes the reason that that one person is given that task to be at the helm is because either they're really good at it or because they're used to being in charge of things, or that the other people within that system just don't feel equipped. So they take a back seat because they're not familiar with the language of feelings, let's say. It's so foreign to them and they wouldn't even know how to have the conversation with their loved one if they tried, and they're really afraid of blowing it. And I think for other people, they are feeling like if they do get involved, they're not going to be able to manage their own emotions. They might come on too strong, they might come on too blaming. And so they really care so much about this that then they back out because they're afraid that they're going to mess things up. So people who take a back seat, sometimes it's interpreted that they take that back seat because they don't care to the same degree or they don't see the same dangers. But sometimes that's just a protective mode where they're just afraid of doing it wrong. And so one of the things that I think is really important is to be able to provide people with the kind of education they need so they understand things together. Do one-stop shopping, work with the family together and teach them what you know, and also help a person feel more equipped to have those conversations so that they can take a role and they also don't leave the other person to feel like it's all up to them. I think when we talk about anything like this, we're talking about a situation where there's tension, where there's history, where there is hurt, where there's confusion. And so coming into that and being able to offer education, being able to offer some guidance and kind of lowering the temperature on all of it, I think is part of what we do. And also, we don't see our jobs as pulling anyone in any direction. It's to present, it's to provide, it's to educate, it's to share. We wouldn't be doing anyone any favors if they got pulled into something and then we just pulled them out. And same with families. We don't want them to feel like we're pulling them in a certain direction. It's a dialogue, it's a conversation, it's working together.
I'm Joe Kelly, and I'm here to discuss the development of intervention from deprogramming to the intervention 101 approach, which varies greatly in that the encouragement of independent thought and freedom, as we talk about when we're talking about the undue influences that have enraptured or captured an individual into an abusive relationship or an abusive group system. The programming really stems from the 1970s when in 1978 there was a seminal event, and that was the suicide at Jonestown. That experience informed so much of the worry and concern and justification for the deprogrammer to hold an individual involuntarily, thinking that the end result of group involvement might be something similar to what happened in Jonestown. When your loved one begins to shift dramatically from one state of thinking to another, from one kind of behavior to another, from one style of approaching life to another, and it seems drastic and dramatic, almost a radical departure from where they had been before, it becomes extremely worrisome to the family. And in most families, if there is a discussion, the tensions flare, or if they are a family that is used to speaking to one another, those techniques no longer seem effective. So people resorted to seeking out individuals known as deprogrammers. And they were willing, some trained, some untrained, mostly untrained, who would kidnap a person and believe that through an emotional snapping moment, and that goes back to the idea that an individual was snapped into a state of mind as a result of the group experience, and therefore they needed to snap out of it. And that snapping process would take place in the emotional environment of a deprogramming. It could be at an invitation of the family and the person agrees to go, or we even have cases where individuals were picked up at gunpoint, thrown into a van, ended up defecating themselves, brought to an isolated location, and were then encouraged to think independently. As you're sitting here thinking the irony of giving someone freedom of thought through the process of holding someone against their will. This became a major theme, and it became a weak point for the groups to dig in to the cult awareness network and grassroots organizations that were helping families get a handle on what was going on in the environment at that time. So there were a group of individuals who had come out of groups, myself and many others who I would love to name: Carol Giambalvo, Patrick Ryan, Dave Clark, Steve Hassan, all of whom came out of groups either through counseling themselves, being counseled, or walking away, and their families in order to keep them out, supporting that exit. The majority of people who we met early on, and I've been involved in this field since 1989, so we're going on 33 years, they were walkaways. So when we would attend conferences, which at that time, the conferences where you would meet other ex-members, were things like the Cult Awareness Network, which grew out of the Citizens Freedom Foundation. And if you have any questions about this, we can address that in the question and answer session. They began to develop more sophisticated strategies. There was something that developed out of the deprogramming model, and a lot of that had to do with that there were many people coming out of groups who themselves were not programmed. They walked away for many, many other reasons. So we began to develop a more sophisticated, more nuanced model of working with individuals who were involved in groups. My mentor in the field was a man named Kevin Garvey, and he developed almost a salon type atmosphere where ex-members would be invited, exit counselors and educators were invited to the environment of speaking with someone in an open environment. At any point, that individual could get up and say, "I've had enough, I'm leaving." And so what we realized is that we had to prepare the family for that eventuality. What do we do? What are the contingencies that we can build into the process? And I think that's where exit counseling came in. It was much more sophisticated as far as dealing with both the family and their investment in the process and the member. So there had to be some kind of contract or agreement that would be established in that meeting between the exit counselor, the family, and the group member. And that shifted things dramatically because simultaneously, there were still those believers in a more hard approach to getting someone out of the group and felt that without this dramatic emotional approach, the cognitive processing could never be re-engaged. And that somewhat came out of the experience of certain groups. There were groups that really did isolate the group member from the family system, from friends, from family, from acquaintances, from the past, from their goals. And the goals then of the group member became the goals of the group. So there were a few people in that group of exit counselors who decided that it was a good idea to really get deeply engaged in involving the family. And that's where something called thought reform consulting developed. And I think it should be mentioned here that a lot of this information I'm drawing from a paper delivered in the year 2000 by Carol Giambalvo in Seattle, Washington, at an American Family Foundation's conference. Carol was hugely instrumental in helping to craft and develop this new approach. And I had the good fortune of working with Carol in many cases. She went on to work on the Colorado model of helping people recover, both long-term members, new members out of groups, and those people born and raised in group systems. So the thought reform consultation process involves much, much more, and involves much, much more family preparation. So the family has a greater stake in the process and is required to be involved. What we find is that when there's this idea of the superhero deprogrammer with the big D on their chest instead of the S of Superman comes into the process, they become the hero who is going to, say abracadabra, the magic phrase, and leave the situation. Person be clear of the cultic group. 3 days later, everybody's fine. But what we've learned is that that's not the case at all, that the recovery process, depending on the individual's involvement and the impact the group has had on that individual, is very specific. And the more we know, the more we can guide the family in being able to support that individual in the aftermath, because largely recovery happens in the aftermath of meeting the exit counselor, the interventionist, the family therapist. That ongoing process of understanding the dynamics that may have influenced your loved one is essential to understanding how best to help them. So it enables a thought reform consulting team to observe how the family works, how they work together under pressure, and who may or may not be appropriate for an intervention. Just because Aunt Alice is somebody who was close to your daughter, she may not be able to restrain herself to the extent that your daughter would see her as an acceptable member of an open and fruitful discussion. So part of what we're trying to surmise is who can deliver the information that the family is most concerned about offering the group member in a way that is both free and acceptable. So we're dealing with looking at the playing field that's been established by the group and the group member. And we're willing to play on that field. We're willing to understand what is the doctrine, what's appealing about the doctrine to your loved one, why they were drawn to that, so that they can feel that you're not looking at them as other, that this experience that they're describing is something that, okay, I can understand that there were many questions about or existential issues that arose in my son, daughter, husband, wife's life that led them to become curious about the alternative belief system or group. And so the attraction is something that the group member then is understanding. If it appears that you understand what it is that appeals to them about the group, then you have some right to have an open and clear discussion about it. But that openness that's required in addressing your real and valid concerns about the changes you're seeing in your loved one are going to take some time and some counsel in developing the strategies which will be effective. So what we hope to achieve in the Intervention 101 approach is to find what specific strategies your family and your situation indicates. And that requires a lot more research in the background of the family, how you communicate with one another, what has been effective, in other words, develop a balance sheet, what has been effective in the counseling environment and what has been ineffective. And that sense of hopelessness that arises within this environment when you feel like we've tried everything, but we know that everything is not always everything, and the situation is not fully discovered until you may have an objective third party help you to see, okay, now this is how this group normally functions. This theory, this position on doctrine, and this position on material world or on reality is something that's going to affect their perception of you and how you see them in their role as a group member. This becomes almost the primary goal of what we try to achieve in Intervention 101. Because without communication, we have no means of reaching the individual and maybe clarifying some points that the family has discovered that they feel that the group member has not even considered. So when we look at what's available and the whole way of approaching someone today is very different, because almost every criticism you could bring up about the group has already been addressed by ex-members on the internet. So the group member may be aware and have been inoculated against that information. So when you bring it up, it's like water off a duck's back. And for you, it seems like a clearly logical rationale for why this person should not be involved in something that you consider destructive. Yet for them, they've already had that worked over. It's been explained away. It's been put aside. And so we have to find new ways of addressing the history of the group, the beliefs of the group, and what the ramifications are of the ideas of the group. And we may need to come up with a new evaluation, a new way of looking at the situation, so that we can approach it freshly and maybe from a point of view that your loved one can hear what we have to say. And I think one of the most important pieces of looking at what is the goal of intervention is quite individual. For some families, the goal is really just to offer their loved one the opportunity to review in an independent and objective environment information that they've learned and is troublesome for the family. The information may not be at all troublesome to the group member. So if it's troublesome to the family and the trouble is both the belief system and the new behaviors, then, and you see the connection between the belief system and the behavior, it's important to gently step in the territory that the group member exists within. And in most family systems, parents want to educate their sons, daughters, husbands want to educate their wives, wives want to educate their husbands, loved ones want to talk freely to the people they're concerned with. All of these things become pieces of an important dialogue that needs to be developed using both the information that we have and the style of functioning of the group, along with the style of functioning of the family. So when someone decides that, okay, this is all wrong, there seems to be this change in behavior from outside, to what extent in a young person's life are we dealing with individuation or their process of understanding their place independent of their family structure in the world? And how is the group hijacking that natural process in order to keep them even further away for a longer period of time from the individual's previous goals? And this problem seems to be one of the most common situations that we deal with in our process of working with families and loved ones, that there's a sudden shift. Recently, the political climate has created certain ideas about how the world functions, certain large amounts of distrust based on elaborate conspiracies layered one on top of the other. To the extent that the person, the son, the daughter is looking at their family, their parents, and saying, where did they go? My loving family who were grandparents and cared about their grandkids are now completely obsessed with unknown agents working on the internet behind the screen, whom in most cases they've never met. This is a new phenomenon, and this requires digging in deeply, being patient, and really being careful about how you approach them. Insults don't work. One has to continue to be respectful and try to distance the behaviors and the effects of the ideas from what you know of that individual in order to hopefully reach them. The good news is that the majority of people who get involved in alternative belief systems leave them. But at what point? And what is the damage done? These are all questions that are very individual and specific to each situation, which is why it becomes very difficult to give general advice to an individual when we know that every family and every interaction of a group member with a group or an abuser is very specific to their own individual experience. It's tapping into something that is unique for that person. Sometimes it's very experiential. Sometimes it's very structural. Sometimes it has a lot to do with undue influence, coercive persuasion. These are all words and ideas and concepts that have nuances quite different from one another, yet carry with it the idea of an individual being carried away by an approach to life that they previously hadn't considered. And when you see, for example, grandparents seeing their grandchildren being, ignored or abused in this new environment due to the proclamations of a prophet or an apostle or some church or a guru who requires immense amounts of service and meditation, which is taking away from the attention normally paid to the children. All of these worries are valid and really should, and can be addressed if the process is handled in a way that all individuals who are affected by this new reality can address fairly and respectfully. So to get the gist of what I'm speaking of when I talk about Intervention 101, we really are intensively involved with getting to know the family and getting to know the individual as best we can in their new setting, in this new reality that they find themselves in. And to what extent are they exploring their own independence, and to what extent has that independence been hijacked by an ideology or an individual who is overwhelming their ability to cognitively process their independent thought and their goals at this point in their lives. So at this point, I would like to open up the room to questions and answers. And there's a lot here. There's a lot of possible questions dealing with the history of intervention and with the current process of Intervention 101. Thank you all for listening, and can't wait to hear your questions. Thank you.